Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and I've got Reed Little from the Contrarians back in the seat. How are you, my friend?
I am doing great, Peter. Thank you for inviting me. Can't wait to talk HTP.
Fantastic. We are going to do an album battle of Hughes Turner Project. This is the album that came out in 2002, the collaboration between Lynn Turner and Glenn Hughes, and the follow-up in 2003, Hughes Turner Project 2, very imaginatively titled. So what we'll do is we'll focus on our favorite tracks on the album, or just spotlight a couple, good, bad, or indifferent. And at the end of the show, we'll give our summation of what we think of both albums and maybe our preferred album out of HTP 1 or 2. So I'll throw it to you. Why don't we talk about the initial album, which came out in 2002? And this was not on a major label. It was on an independent label called the MTM label. So I guess in the early 2000s, melodic rock, heavy rock was pretty well withering on the vine, and you had a lot of these independent record labels like Frontiers that were still propping up that sort of musical genre. And a lot of these labels, Reed, were based in Europe. So,
Sure.
what do you think of this album? What was your initial impression?
Well, I have to say, when it actually came out, it completely passed me by due to some of the unfortunate timing of the first record. So here's a little bit more on the background. Lynn Turner took Glenn Hughes with him on tour in Japan. It was actually a Lynn Turner tour, but he paid Glenn Hughes to be on his tour with him. And then afterwards, the two of them did a tour together called The Voices of Melodic Rock, a tour that Glenn Hughes apparently did not have a particularly good experience on. But then, based on that, they decided to get together and do an album. Glenn, in other interviews, said that the album was put together for the Japanese market. So very targeted at a very specific audience. And when I refer to the circumstances of the recording of this album, they were scheduled to begin recording on September 11th, 2001. So hopefully we're not so far away from September 11th, 2001 that I have to remind people what was going on. That resulted in them pushing back the recording of the album for a bit because you simply couldn't travel by air. Glenn is in Los Angeles. Lynn Turner lives in New York City. So they were unable to travel and meet up for a while. But they eventually got together and they put out this album with intent to tour the Japanese market, although I think they may also have done some European shows. They never came to the US. Anyway, I was occupied otherwise during that time and simply missed this. And later on, I'm not sure how I discovered that it existed, but I am a huge fan of both Lynn Turner and Glenn Hughes. And when I saw, wait a minute, they did an album together? I have to track this down immediately. So I got it, HTP, HTP2, and there's a live album that actually came out between the two albums. And I think that they are all wonderful. Sometimes you get exactly what it says on the tin, right? And if you know anything about the music of Glenn Hughes and Lynn Turner, and you just think in your mind, what would an album with the two of them sound like? That is exactly what this album sounds like. It's melodic hard rock. It's got a ballad that's sung by Lynn Turner. And quick correction, J.J. Marsh is the singer, or is the guitar player. I absolutely adore J.J. Marsh. He is a fantastic guitarist. I don't know anything about him outside of the context of the Glenn Hughes albums. He did multiple albums with Glenn Hughes, and he is a ripping guitar player. All of the songs, except for one, are co-written by Hughes Turner. Well, excuse me, except for two, are co-written by Hughes Turner and Marsh. We can talk about the others as we go. And according to Lynn Turner, they had a self-imposed mandate to do Deep Purple-esque material. Although I think it comes out much more rainbow than Deep Purple, but we can get into that when we talk about specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my first impression of the album was that it falls within my sonic wheelhouse because, if you're familiar with the channel, I love Deep Purple and I love the Deep Purple family. So it just falls right square into that wheelhouse of Rainbow and Deep Purple. I followed a lot of the Glenn Hughes solo albums in the 90s, which I quite enjoyed. And I also followed a lot of Joe Lynn Turner's career post-Rainbow. So I think just on paper, this was a marriage made in heaven. But I guess, as we go deeper into the show, was it really a marriage made in heaven? We'll wait and see. So let's go to the first album. How about we spotlight some songs, good, bad, and indifferent? What's the first song that you'd like to spotlight?
Boy, howdy. So I always like to start with the opening track. The opening track sets the mood for any album. And in this case, again, it tells you exactly what you're getting. In fact, the song is called Devil's Road, and it is inspired by Highway Star, which is to say it's not the exact riff from Highway Star, but it is very much in the lane of a faster Deep Purple type song. Now I think it's interesting that Joe Lynn Turner's is the first voice you hear, because I think that Glenn is kind of he's the slightly dominant member of this team. Although honestly, Joe Lynn Turner or Glenn Hughes was not selling more records than Joe Lynn Turner at this point in his career. But Turner didn't do Burn and Stormbringer, and those albums were huge. So, Glenn was still kind of the alpha. It's got a fantastic, hard driving rock. It's got a great riff, amazing vocals. It's got a great solo. It's everything that you could want from two former singers of Lead Purple doing an album together.
Yeah, I agree. I actually spotlighted this song as well. To me, I thought it was like Death Alley Driver 2, off Straight Between the Eyes, / Highway Star. When you think of Death Alley Driver, that's actually probably got lineage back to Highway Star anyway. So it's got that sort of rollicking, like a car running down the hill sort of riff. Their vocals on this song are quite interesting because Joe Lynn Turner inhabits the mid-range, and then you've got Hughes that inhabits the upper range. When they inhabit the same mid-range, their vocals sound very similar. And there have been times when I've looked at this album and I thought it was actually Hughes, it was actually Turner, and vice versa. So I think that's been a deliberate move that Hughes has to go for that higher vocal range and do his like acrobatics to show, hey, I'm Glenn Hughes. This is me.
Yes.
So it can distinguish between both of them. And when you've got artists, both vocalists who are superb vocalists, what are you going to do in this sort of situation? How on paper are you going to arrange it? I would statistically love to write down, is it even Steven? Because let's face it, both of these artists have got a bit of ego. They've got a lot of history. There's a lot of hubris. I'd love to know on paper, is it like cut down the middle? They're like the Paul Newman and Steve McQueen of metal and hard rock, when you're on the bill poster, where do they fit? Is it 50-50? And I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for a track like this of how it got planned out. And as we go deeper into discussing this, it was an unhappy experience for one of the members. And I'm just wondering, was there a little bit of, in the recording of this?
Quite possible.
Yeah. But what's the selling point of this? It's the vocals. It's them as an artist and their vocals. And I think this song really is a statement of intent, and it pitches where they sit. And Joe Lynn Turner is going to hit that middle ground, the mid-range, and you're going to have Hughes do the upper range, and that's going to be the template for this album. So it's a fine, solid opening. And it's very much the Deep Purple sound because you've got that Hammond organ that fills in the spaces between the guitars. It's retro. And I guess when you're on an independent label, they want to sell albums and they don't want their artists doing anything too out of the box, too left field, too experimental. So that's why a lot of these albums on these Frontier albums, labels or MTM or whatnot are quite conservative and quite straightforward because they want to sell units and they don't want to piss off the fans. They want to just give the fans what they want. And in this project, what do they want to give? Rainbow and Deep Purple.
Right. And you really get that when you get to the live album, especially. And I know we can just touch on the live album later.
Absolutely.
But Glenn Hughes says in his autobiography, he says that Glenn, is a very 70s style singer and that Joe Lynn Turner is a very 80s style singer. And I don't really agree with that separation. I think the two of them are functionally identical in vocal style. Glenn does have a much higher register. He really does. And Glenn is given to vocal histrionics, the vocal vibrato and swooping around his notes. And Joe Lynn Turner is a much more steady kind of holding his notes instead of swooping all around him kind of vocalist. So they have different interpretations of the material. But I would not say that Joe is 80s and Glenn is 70s.
Yeah, that's sort of like damning it with faint praise a little bit. And I mean, Joe came out in the late 70s. He played in a band called Fandango, and they were very much in the foreigner mode. So he's AOR. He's Mr. AOR, and his vocals are very 70s American radio chops. So I don't get this 80s bit. That's right. A very strange comment.
And we'll get back to that here in a minute. But I'm going to pass over the second song real quick. I just want to mention "You Can't Stop Rock and Roll" as a guest solo from Paul Gilbert. And it's a fantastic song. It's another ripper. Paul Gilbert turns in a shreddy solo. But I did find an interview where Glenn Hughes said he was not going to bother with guest musicians in the future. Now, this is after HTP2 came out. Because he said, the fans don't care about the guest soloists. That's for the record label. So it's like getting a particular actor to be in your movie, right? That's how they got financing, was to say, oh, we're going to have Paul Gilbert turn in a solo. But he's like, yeah, it didn't really matter. And I have to say, J.J. Marsh is a hell of a guitar player. He does a fantastic job on this album. He's not as fast as Paul Gilbert, but not having that Paul Gilbert solo would not have changed this album for the worse in any way. So yeah. I'm kind of with Glenn on that.
I am too, because in 2002 with the musical climate, that wouldn't have affected one unit of sale.
Right.
Whether Paul Gilbert or Steve Vai or whoever guests on any of these albums.
Now, later, Joe Lynn has Akira Takajima guest, but Akira was Joe's guitar player. So that's not just, plus nobody in America had ever heard of Akira Takajima. But Joe Lynn Turner needed, for his material, he had to cover Rainbow, Deep Purple, and Yngwie Malmsteen. And Akira can play Yngwie or Ritchie Blackmore equally well. So he was a great fit for that. But he wasn't a selling point. He wasn't a name. Paul Gilbert's not a household name, but in our circles, everybody knows who Paul Gilbert is.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go on to my least favorite song on the album, what I think of as the literally obligatory power ballad, Mystery of the Heart, which is just a straight up AOR ballad. And I will say there is nothing wrong with this song as a straight up AOR ballad. There was one of these songs on every one of the albums that Joe Lynn did with Rainbow. There was one on Slaves and Masters called Love Conquers All. This song is very, very similar to Love Conquers All. It's a song, or it's a style that fits Joe Lynn Turner's voice to a T. I just don't care for it. And there's a ballad on the second album which I like quite a bit. So I'm not an anti-ballad. It's just this one particular style really doesn't do it for me, and I think they could have made a much more interesting song.
Yeah, I wasn't going to select this song, but I'll just do a little counterpoint. To me, it's Street of Dreams Part 2, and it's a template that Joe Lynn recycles again and again and again, and he loves that sort of that very slow, mid-paced type of ballad, wistful lyrics, lost romance, whatever, and as they say, when you're on a good thing, stick to it. And that's what he wants to do. I mean, he had the biggest success in Rainbow with those power ballads. Stone Cold and Street of Dreams were troubling the lower parts of the top 30. Got a lot of radio airplay in America. So it works. And
I am sure
and I guess MTM, they probably said, let's bring it to the table. You've got to bring this sort of material.
Oh, I'm sure it is exactly what the Japanese fans wanted.
Yes.
I have 100% confidence of that.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and just do a triplet of songs that start to be outside the Deep Purple Rainbow box and are actually my favorites on the album.
Okay.
Sister Midnight is a soul number. It's got a little bit of an R&B groove. There's a groove going on. It's left field from AOR, and I love the interplay of the Hughes Turner vocals. They take it in turns, and that's when I think this album works the best, where they're not competing each other, but they take it in turns, and there's more in synergy in respect to the material. I like that song. Better Man is another great one that's got a bit of an R&B groove. I wrote down Sail Away by Deep Purple. So if you listen to the melody line, it's very much like Sail Away from the Burn album, except it's got a very hard R&B groove. And finally, I love Fade Away. It's got these exquisite string arrangements. It's melodic. It's dramatic. It's got towards the end, it throws everything but the kitchen sink in, the piano, the strings, the guitars. It's melancholy. It's haunting. I love the push and pull chorus. Those three songs, I think, are the strongest in the album. They fit in the middle of the album. I gravitate to them because they're a little bit outside the left field of, just the normal AOR or the Deep Purple Rainbow, and more R&B, more funk, and trying something a little bit different.
Right. I agree with all of that. Glenn Hughes at this point in his life was very into confessional lyrics like you get in Better Man. He had certain metaphors like the flowing river that he uses in a lot of songs. That appears again here.
The higher power always refers to the higher power.
Always refers to the higher power. That's what he needed to help him get over his addiction.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, Addiction, I think, is Glenn's best solo album. So I'm going to move on to the John Sykes guest appearance on Heaven's Missing an Angel. So it's actually very rare for John Sykes to guest on other people's material. John has been kind of a recluse, right? I mean, he did a couple of solo albums after leaving Lizzie he was in Whitesnake and then kicked out of Whitesnake, and he did Blue Murder. Then he did a couple of solo albums and he sort of disappeared, but every very rare once in a while, he would reappear and do a track. And he does Heaven's Missing an Angel. And I don't think that Joe Lynn sings on this song. John Sykes has credit as backup vocals, and it's Glenn singing. And here's the thing. I don't think this is a particularly good song, but it's a very schizophrenic song. It starts out like a power ballad, and then when you get to the chorus, it goes into this funky beat. And it's got this really screechy, compressed guitar tone. And you go, oh, that's not JJ pretending to be Richie Blackmore. That's just John Sykes coming in at this point, right? And Sykes turns in a solo, which is actually one of his slower, more melodic solos. So you get a lot of that Sykes vibrato for those of you who are counting from the previous show, 3 wind-ups in this song.
I was waiting for that.
One
3
before
wind-ups.
every chorus. It's baby brew, heaven's missing an angel. So, one before every chorus. They're not, I will say this, they are mixed way back. So clearly Glenn was not as fond of those as John, because they're not right up at the front of the song. But, you know, I want to really enjoy the song, but I don't dislike it, but it's not one of my favorites on the album. And honestly, I think they could have done without it. But he's a stunt casting. Hey, we've got, you know, John Sykes guesting on it. And I'm sure that was cool for the fans.
Yeah. I wonder what it would take for John Sykes not to do a wind-up. Would they need to hypnotize him? Would they need to put him on a couch and sort of put the little watch and you will not do a wind-up?
That's how he announces his presence, man. You haven't? I've got one more I want to do. You have another one?
Yep. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were going to do it. I'll do it. On the ledge, light and shade, epic closer. I love the interplay between JLT and Glenn Hughes and these wonderful lush string arrangements. Some really good melodic string arrangements on this album. So I think this album works best where there's light and shade. And there are some songs where, you know, you've got the balance within a song between it being really powerful, crunchy, hard rock and the light and, you know, a little bit more tranquil and a little bit more calmer. But I like that. I think On the Ledge is, you know, a nice little closer to the album.
I love On the Ledge, and it's one of the, or I should say it is the only song with a co-write from Vince DiCola, the keyboard player. So it's not a surprise that song has more keyboards than any of the other songs. Yep. And I suspect, I did not look at the credits, but I don't think they've got string credits. I bet that's keyboard strings that we're hearing.
I think so. It would blow the budget out if you brought in a string quartet or whatnot, but it sounds authentic and it really does underpin a lot of the melodies and feel of this album. So
right.
I guess in summation, okay, go on.
One more I need to call out. So again, this album was supposed to start being recorded on September 11th, 2001. Joe Lynn, who lives in New York, tells a story about seeing the second plane hit the World Trade Center. Lots of people say that. I have no idea if it's true or not. But they thought they should commemorate the event in song on the album. And fascinatingly to me, rather than doing this kind of maudlin, you know, jingoistic pro-America song, which a lot of rock bands did right after September 11th, right? There was a lot of that stuff. But these guys wrote a song called Ride the Storm, which was about the necessity for establishing world peace. And I would say, if you didn't know the story behind it, you would never listen to that song and say it's about September 11th. There is nothing in this song that refers to it in any way.
Yeah.
It's just, I only know that because in the live album, Joe Lynn Turner prefaces this song by saying, we wrote this song about the September 11th terrorist attacks.
No, nice.
So, and it's not, again, it's an okay song. I mean, there aren't any songs on the album I actually dislike. I just don't think it's one of the better songs on the album, but I think it's fascinating that it's about September 11th, but it isn't about September 11th.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess my summation of this album is that I like the non-rock songs. I like the R&B soul-influenced songs much more than the rock. I find that the rock songs are maybe too conventional and do play into the Deep Purple Rainbow wheelhouse, and that's ironic because I love those bands to bits. But I think the material that just jumps out is that middle section where they have a bit of an R&B soul workout, and you really hear the voices. And this project, as I said, plays up to the voices. It not necessarily the music. So we go to 2003. We go to HTP2. And to be quite frank, if I had to choose an album that I play by number of plays in my collection, HTP would win by a country mile. I play this a hell of a lot. I don't know why.
The first one or the second one?
No, the second one. I actually play this a lot more. So pick a song. Let's start it off.
Yeah, so I agree with the general sentiment. Hughes Turner Project is a fun album, right? Especially if you're already a fan of those guys. It is everything you could want from an album with them, but it's no more than that. It's a paycheck album. HTP2, I think, is an upgrade in every way. I listen to it way more often than I listen to HTP1. And I want to shout out real quick, these, not only after HTP did they do a live album. Now, the live album is mostly Rainbow and Deep Purple songs with a couple of HTP numbers, and Glenn Hughes even does one Black Sabbath number, although it's not on my pressing. It's only on, I think, the European pressings for whatever reason. But then Glenn did a solo album, Songs in the Key of Rock, and Lynn Turner did a solo album, JLT. So this is a prolific period in these guys' lives. They do an album together, they do a live album, they each do a solo album, and then they come back and they do another HTP album. And I love, if you have a chance and you listen to Songs in the Key of Rock and JLT and then listen to this, you can hear exactly the differences in their solo music and the project they were doing together. They clearly had a mindset that they were going to do a specific type of music on this album, which is a little different than they do on their solo stuff, especially for Glenn. JLT is actually more reminiscent of HTP. I have to get my 3-letter initials correct. But I love this song from this album right off the bat. There's much more bass in HTP2. So all of the songs you get to hear Glenn's bass, and Glenn is such an underrated bass player. He is so good at hard rock bass. He brings that funk style to hard rock songs, which gives him a real identity. I'm going to start off with the song Alone I Breathe, which is actually the second song on the album. And for me, it's a real earworm, especially the chorus. And there's just, all I have to do is see the title and I can hear them singing in harmony. There's so much harmony on this album. They sing in harmony, and it just sounds fantastic. They're actually doing a duet rather than, most of the songs have a main vocalist and then the other guy sings backup vocals. But in this song, they sing an actual duet. They sing co-lead vocals. So that gives it a different feel. And the two of them mesh great. Just like you said, Lynn's holding down the middle ground and Glenn is way up top. But together, they sound fantastic.
Great. Well, I'm going to pick the best song out of the whole project. And actually, debatably, it may be one of either Lynn Turner or Glenn Hughes' finest songs. And I'm talking about Losing My Head. I think that is a magnificent song. The material, the song, it's on point. It's got lyrics that are direct, emotional. It's about a breakup, and it's really head and shoulders above any of the material on this album. It's really heartfelt lyrics. It's got a tasty guitar. You've got JJ Marsh, who's doing really well, but you've got Vi as a special guest that adds this really swirly serpentine type of riff that really adds drama to it. But the lyrics are so emotional and haunting. Like, I'm losing my head. I'm going insane. I heard what you said. Your voice in my brain. I'm already gone. My eyes turning red. The damage is done. I'm losing my. Wow. It's just, I guess from an emotional perspective, I was going through a little bit of drama in my life, and this was a song that I gravitated to. And reading on social commentary and a lot of the YouTube comments, a lot of people gravitate to this song and said, "Wow, this should have been a hit. This fair income, this should have been played on radio in that time, and it's just so far out of the genre. It's a real diamond in the rough, and I love the Eastern melody line. It's got kind of a Kashmir feel to it. Yeah, a real heavy riff. What do you think of this song?
I absolutely love it. And let's not forget another guest, Chad Smith from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, plays drums. And sorry, I've got a fan going. It keeps blowing my damn hair in my mouth.
That's all right.
Chad Smith and Glenn Hughes are tight. They've been tight for decades. I have no idea how those guys met, but apparently they are like best friends. There are some really funny stories that I can't repeat in Glenn's autobiography about him and Chad Smith. But that difference, the different drummer, you've got Steve Vai on guitar. Like you said, it's so different than every other song on this album. I don't think there was any space on radio in 2004 for this song. But you know what it reminds me of is a song off of Whitesnake's Slip of the Tongue, which of course was Steve Vai. Think about something like Judgment Day off of Slip of the Tongue.
I think it's better than Judgment Day.
Oh, I think it's a better song. I'm
Absolutely.
just saying that that's the type of guitar. In fact, the guitar tone that Steve uses is very similar to that, even though this is 14 years later.
Yep.
Slip of the Tongue came out in 89, something like that.
It came out in 89, yes.
So it's been a long time, but it seems that by this point in his career, when Steve was doing hard rock, that's what he went back to. So, but yeah, I love this song. Absolutely love it. And I had that exact same note about the Eastern, as Martin Popoff calls it, the Egypto sounding music, especially in the keyboards.
We should do an episode on the Egypto because that'd take us 2 hours to go through that well that's been mined, the Kashmir well, because there's been so many great songs that have been mined out of that. I think this is top 10 Hughes or Turner. I would put it, I rank it that highly. It just sticks out. And I'm convinced that it could have been a radio hit. Maybe the wrong time, maybe 5 years earlier, maybe 5 years later, but it's just such a high quality song. This is the one I gravitate to, and there is earworm in that chorus. So this is one where I think they're absolutely on fire. All right, have you got another song that you'd like to spotlight on HTP2?
Probably a couple. I'm going to go ahead and move to my favorite song. So one of the things that I think is a big upgrade on this album is the sequencing is so good. There are fast songs followed by slow song followed by fast song. So it gives it a very nice ebb and flow as you go through it. It keeps it interesting. But I think that they miss one time. So my favorite track is Burning the Sky. So it's a little bit slower. It's spacey and atmospheric. I think it should have been the final song on the album. But instead it's track 10 or 9. Anyway, there are 2 more songs after it, depending on which version of the CD you have. Because there was a Japanese only bonus track on some CDs. So it's got another guest solo, for whatever that's worth, from a guitarist named Jeff Coleman. And I know very little about Jeff Coleman other than that it seemed like around the turn of the century, he was showing up as a guest on every artist that I liked, right? He did an album with Phil Mogg and Pete Way. It wasn't Mogwai, they called it something else, Chocolate something. I never heard the album. But I mean, he was all over classic hard rock circles around the turn of the century, but he never really seemed to, he didn't join a mainstream band. He never really seemed to break into the mainstream. Although I Googled him and he's still very busy. He tours with the Alan Parsons Project as part of their live band, and he's a member of the current version of Asia and all sorts of other stuff. So, I mean, he's still very much out there. Not a selling point, he wasn't a name like Steve Vai. But it's really more, this song is more, It's like you were saying on the first album how your favorite songs were the ones that weren't Rainbow or Deep Purple, right? And that's this track for me. It's again spacey, atmospheric. It's got a lot more keyboards to it. I love the harmony on the chorus, where Glenn is soaring up over the top and Joe Lynn singing through the middle. The two voices just mesh so beautifully together. See if I have any. Oh, and it's got this really long outro, right? Which again, that's why it feels like a last song on the album to me, because it just goes and goes and goes. And you're like, oh, there's 2 more songs. Oh, that's weird. That felt like it would end the album for me.
Yeah. I think a bit of a minor blemish is sometimes Glenn Hughes needs to rein it in. He can push it too hard in regards to the vocal gymnastics. And that's always been a flaw with Glenn. Now, don't get me wrong, guys, folks. I love Glenn Hughes. I think he's a great vocalist, but sometimes he can go over the top. And just look at Mark III Deep Purple, and that will sort of confirm that. But in this album, sometimes I think he needs a producer to just say, okay, Glenn, let's just rein it in a little bit. And the voice needs to service the song, not the song is servicing the voice. Right. It's like in shredding guitar. So I'm going to focus on Talk About It Later, which is the last track that I have on the CD. And it starts off very tranquil and quiet. And then it switches into this dirty slide guitar piece. And then it's got a little bit of a funky groove, a little bit of a groove underpinning. It's got this nice light and shade. And that's what I like. The songs that stick out to me, as you said, are the ones that are funk, R&B, or have nice light and shade. Maybe I've just played this album so much, I'm used to this as being the closer, but I can see where you're coming from in respect of Burning the Sky as maybe a more logical closing track. But Talk About It Later. I like that song a lot. I'll put a shout out also for Going My Way. To me, that is very retro. It's got that Deep Purple Hammond sound filling the gaps again. And you've got this nice little Baroque melody where J.J. Marsh is really channeling Ritchie, and all the little arpeggio lines. I wrote down Ritchie'd be proud. So, as I said, you've got to give what the punters want. And, if you see the Glenn Hughes and Joe Lynn Turner, you've got it in your head. This is the sort of sound that you want to hear.
Speaking of which, as I was listening to Let's Talk About It Later, also a song that I very much enjoy. Again, I like HTP2 just across the board. I think it's at least an 8. The first album's probably a 7, maybe a 6.5, but the HTP2 is at least an 8 for me. And I love that swampy slide guitar. Probably Jeff Coleman again instead of J.J. Marsh this time, because he's the guest on this track as well. But I cannot hear Joe Lynn's voice on this song. And I've tried. And like you say, sometimes if Glenn reins it back, you can't really distinguish him and Joe Lynn, which may be one reason why Glenn is just all over the place with his vocal tricks. But I don't think I hear Joe. I would love to be proven wrong on that, but I can't hear his voice. So I'm like, was this meant for a Glenn Hughes solo album maybe? And they just needed an extra track and decided to throw it on this?
Yeah.
Who knows? I don't know. It's a great song though. I agree. It's a very good song. Whoops. Sorry. I've got 2 computers going and I'm using the wrong mouse here. So the other song I was going to call out is Lost Dreams. Now this, in particular, is the very much the Street of Dreams analog for these 2 albums. You'll notice Joe Lynn uses the Dreams thing a lot. He used it in Street of Dreams. He used it in King of Dreams on Slaves and Masters. I know that album gets a lot of stick. I actually really enjoy Slaves and Masters. I think it's a great Deep Purple album. I don't know why people are like, oh man, I love Come Taste the Band, but man, Slaves and Masters is just too much like Rainbow. I'm like, wait, It's clearly still Deep Purple.
I agree with you. I think it's very underrated. And the Cut Runs Deep is one of my favorite Deep Purple songs from that era. And I think it rings around the Battle Rages On, which is absolutely diabolical. Horrible album. Bring out the hate.
Okay.
But anyway, but I don't mind it.
I actually like the Battle Rages On. We can talk about that someday.
We can talk about it later.
Good reference. Lost Dreams. So Lost Dreams, the thing that makes it more interesting than the ballad on HTP is that the music has more going on. It's not just keyboards doing chords so that Jolene can sing about lost love over them. There's an actual song. I should say there's a guitar part. There's, bass and drums. In fact, a very funky bass line. So on this album, like I say, Glenn plays way more prominently on this album than he did on the first one, which is another big upgrade and helps distinguish it from the more rainbow-esque material.
It's kind of strange that they sound very invested in the project, or especially Glenn Hughes. He sounds very committed, invested. There's a lot of emotion. I mean, even going back to Losing My Head, which I love. But you were referencing prior to this, to the catch-up, some interviews you came across where Glenn Hughes seems to be very, not really engaged at all and sort of washes his hands at this project. I find that quite puzzling.
Yeah, if anybody, just Google HTP interviews. I only found a couple, and they're clearly the type of interviews where the interviewer emailed out questions, right? And Lynn Turner responded with paragraphs of information, and Glenn Hughes would have, very few words, no more than a sentence or two. So I wanted to read a quick excerpt from Glenn's autobiography. He only mentions this project twice. And he says, the two albums that I did with Lynn Turner, and this is no disrespect to him whatsoever, reminded me of the music that I didn't want to do anymore. I wrote some great songs for those records, and they were very melodic, in the box 80s style material, but it wasn't fulfilling me.
Yeah.
And again, I have his solo album, and frankly, I will listen to HTP 2 over Songs in the Key of Rock any day. So I like the material he was doing when he was in what he thinks of as an 80s mindset way better than the solo stuff he was putting out at the time.
Yeah. I actually recall that quotation in the book, and I raised my eyebrows. I thought that was very strange. It's a great read, folks. It's a harrowing read, and how he got through Alive from the 70s and that cocaine addiction in the 70s, 80s, 90s is he is a true rock and roll survivor. And, his vocals are just so spick, even, to this day. It's just a miracle.
Yeah. I just saw today, they've announced now they're recording a 5th Black Country Communion album.
Good. I think that is probably one of the best projects for him. And there's a bit of creativity, and I think you've got personnel around him that kind of reins him in a little bit. When he does his solo, I think he's got the keys to the kingdom. He just does the same album again and again and again. I think he needs to be challenged. And when you've got those personnel around them who are very strong personalities, I think creatively, it's probably the best project for him.
Right. Hey, maybe we can do a Black Country Communion show one of these days. That would be fun.
Yeah. And what was that other project that he did after Black Country Communion?
He did a couple. So he did one called California Breed.
What did you think of that?
Mediocre.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't hate it, but it had Andrew Wyatt.
Yeah.
I think Watt.
Yeah.
Who's now producing everything that comes out of Hollywood, it seems like. He just did a couple albums with Ozzy, and he did the last Iggy Pop album. And it had Jason Bonham. It had Jason Bonham on drums. And then Jason split immediately to go play club dates with Sammy Hagar. Glenn Hughes is doing all this press saying California Breed's going to be the greatest thing ever, and they put out one album and die. And then he joined the Dead Daisies, and he's done 2 albums with the Dead Daisies, which I quite enjoy, but they're very, very slick. They have the same production sound as Whitesnake's Good to Be Bad. Right? It's all redlined. It's just everything's right up in your face. There's no subtlety to it. And they're fine, but they're not wonderful. I enjoy listening to them, but they're not my favorite albums. So I think Black Country Communion is a much better vehicle for it.
Yeah, no, I'll be interested to hear when that comes out. And I've got those albums and I like them. But do I play them a lot? Probably not. A lot of those Glenn Hughes solo albums have got a very short shelf life in my listening, but except this one, HTP2. So maybe let's come back to our final summation. What is the preferred album? I guess HTP2. Yep.
Yeah. By Country Mile.
Yes. I think it's a fine album and one that's worth investigating, and hopefully it's still in print because I couldn't imagine it would have been selling many units. It would have pandered to a couple of particular markets where melodic rock was very strong, and I'm talking about Eastern Europe and Japan. But I think the other territories probably not so much.
Yeah, I mean it can't have sold much in the United States. And I don't, again, they never toured the US clearly by this point. And Glenn has said, and Joe Lynn Turner, I think even still lives in Eastern Europe.
Always good to have you on the show, Reed. It was great doing a track down memory lane on those 2 albums. And they certainly got played a lot in the early 2000s, maybe one more than others to this very day. But always great talking about the Deep Purple family. You can see Reed Little on the Contrarians and various other channels. Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. And one thing's for sure, Reed and I will do another show very soon. Cheers.
I look forward to it. Cheers.
See ya.